Christian fascism should probably be an oxymoron, contradiction in terms. But the fact is that Christians and Christian theological concepts have figured heavily in fascist movements, as they have in all the major modern ideologies. In fact, an idea I've toyed with is that all modern ideologies are derived from, partially promulgated out of Christian theologies and notions of the past, but arrive with partial truths half-formed. So consider in the liberalism of Grotius and Locke, there's a partial truth there from the perspective of the patristic church. The individual soul, the integrity of the individual soul, but blown to the point of a political doctrine of absolute individualism. Or consider nationalism. Last time I was talking about how nationalism in some ways takes over the Christian concept of the Holy Spirit, except that the Holy Spirit is narrowed into a particularistic Geist of a nation. Instead of God calling people out of all nations, as we hear in St. Paul's letters, it seems instead for nationalists that nations are called out by God particularistically and individuals left set within them. Maybe fascism too has its roots in certain Christian notions and ideas, half recovered, half distorted. Consider, for instance, the basic narrative of fascism. Fascism, scholars of political theory think of as a form of ultra-nationalism. It is kind of a radicalized form of nationalism, often racialized, as in the case of Hitler, but not always so racialized, as in the case of Mussolini. But what these forms of fascism share is a retelling of the story of the fall. Thinking of fascists as taking over Christian concepts and developing political theologies, one might note that fascists often tell a story of some golden age in the past that has been lost and needs to be violently recovered, some Eden. But unlike an Orthodox Christian belief, this Eden isn't the Garden of Eden, it's some moment in national history. Hitler's First and Second Reich, he was going to reestablish through the Third Reich after the humiliations of the First World War. Mussolini was going to reestablish what he thought was the grandeur of the Italian people resident in Roman politics of the empire. And so there's this Edenic period. Fascists are radicalized nationalists and conservatives who no longer believe in gradualism or the institutions of that moment, and so they become radical reactionaries who think that there needs to be revolutionary action, but not revolutionary action of the left, but revolutionary action of the right, not toward the future, if you like, but toward the past, toward a lost Edenic past of national greatness. Also taken over from Christians, arguably, in fascist ideology, is the notion that there's some new Satan or some tempter that has defiled or taken away the innocence of Eden. Some serpent. Oftentimes this is figured by ultra-nationalists as some ethnic pollutant or some scapegoat in the polity that is said to have brought down or weakened the nation. Liberal elites, intellectuals, Jews are often targets of fascists, but racial minorities, ethnic minorities of various kinds. In one of your two readings for today, l'Œuvre Française, which is a neo-fascist movement in France, I believe from the late 20th century, literally means the French work, developed the language of fascism in the direction of newspeak. And newspeak is this way of talking where there's this double meaning. As you saw in your short excerpt from their piece, Blood, Soil, and Faith, these French fascists were arguing that the anti-racists had become the real racist. This is in, I believe, the 1990s, so it's interesting because this double speak has become typical of the new right, if you spend any time on the internet or listen to the far right in the United States and Europe today. It's become a common trope to say that anti-racists are the real racists, that those who want social justice are the real discriminatory ones. And you see that in this piece that I assigned, that there's a kind of inversion of who's to blame, right, for the sort of problems of society. The real racists are the anti-racists, and what they're actually attacking and discriminating against, and this is where Christianity comes into this fascist narrative for French fascists, is the Christian tradition and people of European extraction, as it says on your reading for page 372. Clearly there are racial elements there, but there's also a kind of French Catholic fascist sensibility, ultra-nationalist sensibility that French Catholic traditions have been imperiled, right, by kind of modern liberalism or secularism and are in decline, so they need to be reestablished through revolutionary action. Final element of fascist storytelling, that ideological storytelling that is derived clearly from Christian storytelling, is Messiah, the notion of the return of a savior, but here the savior of the nation, right? So fascism is often characterized by belief in need for an extraordinary leader, an extraordinary person who in a time of emergency, in the nick of time, sort of saves the national spirit. The national spirit sends forth this exceptional individual to save it. An exceptional man usually is born, able to take miraculous measures outside the standard governing laws to restore order. This exceptional figure, think of Mussolini and Hitler or neo-fascism in the world today, is like a walking miracle for the movement. There's a kind of cult of personality around them, and adherence to the nation becomes adherence to this person's personality that is said to be allowed to suspend the legal order, kind of political miracle working, right? Where you don't have to follow the laws per se, because the job of this miracle worker is to resurrect and restore the nation, possibly through a new apocalypse or crisis, a new war or purging, a violent seizing of government, but some great reckoning with the betrayers and pollutants of the nation who are purged so that the nation can be restored to its Edenic qualities. So I'm suggesting that fascism, like liberalism, like nationalism, takes over and creatively modifies certain concepts from the Christian past that we've been reading. Narrative elements, but also concepts like Messiah, concepts like spirit, concepts of the apocalypse, resurrection, Eden. The heftiest piece of reading we did for fascism as political theology is Carl Schmitt, the German Nazi jurist and Roman Catholic. He was a Catholic. He became less and less Catholic the more he became a National Socialist, but he never totally disavowed his Catholicism, and he often sort of grafted his fascism together with his Christian faith or with Christian concepts. And you see that in your reading for today. I assigned the dialogue on power and access to the holder of power. And one way I think about this, though we can talk about it more certainly in discussion because there's so much that could be said about it, but one way I think about this very strange dialogue written by Schmitt is that it in some ways is a retelling of the Christian notion of the transcendence and almighty features of God. There is an element here of kind of Christian political theology that Schmitt has taken over, and he's tried to sort of theorize in the direction of a kind of sovereign power that is fascistic. Schmitt, I should say as an aside, has seen a major rehabilitation. He was a persona non grata in the post-war period, intellectually, culturally, in Germany, in Europe. No one studied him in the United States. Today, in the last 10 to 15 years, there are a lot of Schmittians. There are a lot of intellectual Schmittians about in the United States. I'll just give you one name. Adrian Vermeule, a law professor at Harvard, is an open Schmittian, and he's a figure in the New Right. He's a Catholic convert who sort of flirts with fascistic ideas of power, dictatorial power. Okay, so some remarks on this dialogue on your reading that is a very strange reading and deserves sort of slow, careful attention because it is so strange. It's a dialogue, like I said, it's a philosophical dialogue. And Carl Schmitt appears in the dialogue under the initials CS. And he's engaged in this collaborative, sometimes also critical exchange with a young youth, as the dialogue says, that's identified as Y. They're having this dialogue back and forth on power. And essentially, CS is trying to school Y into a kind of dictatorial conception of the cosmos. That's what you have to keep your eye on, because it's a rather mystifying document. But I think if you take a sort of bird's eye view of the document, what it's doing in terms of political argumentation is trying to argue that dictatorship is both cosmically the case for reality, but also politically the case for society. So it begins with CS arguing, this kind of Carl Schmitt figure, arguing that political theology has undergone a fall in the modern world. Should resonate with what I was just talking about. This fall from what he calls, quote, earlier times is due to the fact that God is no longer said to be the source of power, but instead what CS calls a modern and especially metropolitan man, and he seems to say it with a certain irony and disgust, has turned power into a secular human affair. In other words, CS is saying that modern people see power as immanent, as something sort of demystified. It's something that we exercise on each other. Think here, political scientist students, of the way that power is studied in your classes. It's not taught that it has any enchanted or mystic features to it, right? Power is something that humans exercise on other humans, and so you have a kind of secularized view here of power as not having a divine source or authority. And CS thinks that that's a problem, that there's been a fall away from divine notions of the origin of power. The way he tries to suggest or argue that power should be thought of again as a transcendent or divine property, and this is where the argument takes a strange turn, so listen here, is through what he calls the problem of the antechamber, page 34 in your reading. The problem of the antechamber, according to CS, is that power always transcends any one holder of it. Say that again. The problem of the antechamber, according to CS, is that power always transcends any one holder of it. As he says in the dialogue, quote, even the most absolute ruler is reliant on reports and information and dependent on his counselors, such that out of the flowing infinite sea of truth and lies, even the most powerful human can at most ladle out a few droplets. That quote is from page 34. Now this is strange because you might think if no one person can absolutely wield power, it might recommend democratizing authority or power. It might recommend that even the most dictatorial societies in fact require power sharing. Instead, the CS character in the dialogue draws the exact opposite inference. The fact that no one person holds all the power, according to CS, means that power itself transcends all constituent members. As he says on page 32, power has, quote, an independent grandeur of its own, a surplus value. So CS is saying that power goes beyond every person in a particular polity, every sovereign representative and constituent member of it. And this surplus of power that goes beyond any one member, CS thinks points to power itself transcending the natural order or not being immanent within it. For this reason, CS very tellingly quotes St. Paul and Pope Gregory. I told you that Carl Schmitt was something of a Catholic, though I don't know how to exactly square these views, but he thought of himself as a Catholic. He'd been baptized and sacramentally was part of the Catholic Church. And he quotes Pope Gregory the Great's notion of all power is deriving from, quote, the highest power and therefore divine. Page 41. He quotes both St. Paul and Pope Gregory and says, see, they say all power is divine or has a kind of divine origin. We read Luther making an argument like this in a very, very different way than Schmitt a few weeks back. All power is divine for Schmitt, not because it's a punishment for original sin, but because all power transcends all wielders of it in particular society. Strange argument, no? Very strange. Go back to your reading and look at it. C.S.'s theology of power, however, we have to note, given our study of the patristics, seems to lack Christological content. I mean, the personality of Christ, of Jesus of Nazareth, doesn't seem to be present in or shaping or incarnating God's power. Seems like C.S. has taken over the idea of the omnipotence of God from the Christian tradition, the transcendence of God, the almightiness of God, without also taking the incarnation as central, the suffering servant as central, the God who makes himself weak, the God who makes himself poor, the God who dies on a cross. And so there isn't what I would call thick Christological content. Instead, and feel free to disagree with me on this, I'm thinking out loud here with Schmitt, the divine power lies beyond good and evil for Schmitt. It's strange as though the power, C.S. draws the inference that power itself is somehow beyond good and evil. In other words, goodness is not an attribute of divine transcendence for C.S. as one finds in traditional Christian theology, such as St. Augustine, right? That God and the good are one and the same. Instead, page 41, C.S. says, power is an independent reality set against everyone, even the holder of power. Power is stronger than any human good and any human evil. Very strange, in light of our reading of the patristics, to say that power is stronger than any human good or any human evil. It seems like C.S. thinks that his argument about the antechamber gestures at or suggests that power transcends the natural order, any one wielder of it, and that this points to a cosmos where power itself is beyond good and evil, such that God decides what is good and evil. Page 41. Himself decides what's good and evil. What's going on here? Power is the sole and major attribute of God. So you're getting a kind of version of theology where God is not marked, like I said, Christologically by agape, self-suffering and giving love. But instead, God's major attribute is power. And so there isn't a unity between goodness, love, and God's almightiness, as there is for Augustine in Schmitt's account. Instead, God is beyond good and evil, and when you worship God, you're worshiping power. This is a God without Christological content, like I said, and rather just kind of pure will. It's the divinization and worship of a steep peak of power against liberal and democratizing tendencies. Scholars of fascism note that one of the major themes of fascist ideology is immersing individuals in a pyramid or hierarchy of national power beyond the self. Quasi-religious experiences or ecstatic experiences of being in crowds and rallies are a major part of fascist politics. To be with the leader, to be lifted up and taken, transported beyond normal feelings by the leader, by a power that resets the order and humiliates the enemies of the nation. C.S. certainly takes this notion of a hierarchy and peak of power that goes beyond even its highest wielder as underscoring that God is basically a dictator or a kind of dictatorial authority that can dictate what is good and evil. And it seems like the analogy for C.S. is that a rightly ordered polity, like a rightly ordered cosmos, is also one with a dictator who is beyond good and evil. Think of what I was saying earlier about fascist notions of the leader principle as an extraordinary individual who is born to save the nation, right? And gets to act outside of law and norms in order to work miracles of power. So there's a critique here clearly of secular democracy coming from Schmitt. The problem on this view with democracy is it tries to place power beneath the law. Democracy claims everyone, moreover, has an equal share in power. But if power is a transcendental force, as C.S. thinks, that goes beyond even its uppermost wielder, then power is by its very nature anti-democratic. It comes down from on high. This is a very weird argument. I'm not even sure entirely how it works. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't understand why the surplus of power makes Schmitt infer that power is peaked in this way as opposed to that power is shared. In the context of 1950s post-war Europe, C.S.'s divination of all powers beyond good and evil has the unmistakable implication of ascribing Hitlerian exercises of power an attribute of the divine. Hitler had this notion of a state of exception, an exceptional individual who, because of the crisis of the nation and its pollution by ethnic minorities, he was obsessed in his case with the Jews, but with a number of other ethnic minorities like Polish people, etc., etc., etc. Because of that, there had to be this sort of exercise of dictatorial power. Hitler started out working within Germany's liberal democracy in the interwar period, but he declared himself, after the burning of the Reichstag, this sort of supreme decider in a time of emergency, right? In a time of emergency. And Schmitt unmistakably seems to be justifying that. I told you he was a Nazi jurist. He was a committed Nazi. He's a very weird Nazi. He doesn't do a lot of racial theorizing, but he seems to justify a kind of political theology where what's the highest in religion and in politics is just pure power, right? At the level of politics, power is dictatorial. At the level of the cosmos, power is dictatorial. How do we get there according to Schmitt? Schmitt has, remember I mentioned that fascists are revolutionaries, but they're revolutionaries toward the past. They think they're going to restore kind of lost Eden. That distinguishes them. Conservatives often become fascist without realizing that they're becoming fascist, but if you take my ideologies class, you'll see that the father of conservatism as an ideology, Edmund Burke, believed in gradualism. He didn't think you should make any sudden changes. He thought that you should... There's a great deal more that could be said here, but conservatives believe in a certain reverence for the status quo, no matter what it happens to be. And fascists don't. Fascists, a little bit like Marxists, believe that maybe everything is so bad that you need a revolutionary negation, except that they're not revolutionaries toward the future, they're reactionaries toward the past. And Schmitt says in your reading that there needs to be a sort of reversion. He suggests in your reading that there needs to be a reversion to the rightly ordered cosmos and the rightly ordered polity as dictatorial. That's going to happen for Schmitt through sort of revolution, or a final total disaster, maybe is a better way of putting it. It's not a revolution from below. Schmitt isn't expecting Marxist or leftist style revolution of the working people per se. He's expecting some final total disaster to require power to step on the stage and reassert itself. This can be seen as a retelling of parts of the Christian story, the crucifixion and death of Jesus, except now the nation and the leader supplant Jesus. They replace Jesus, and they have to undergo a final disaster or apocalypse in order to be resurrected. For Schmitt, the problem with democracy is he sees democracy as tied to a political theology that is inherently atheistic because it equalizes power, and for Schmitt, God is just power. And you see how that works? So go back to the dialogue and consider that for Schmitt, democracies worship a false political theology of justice, rights, equality, and power sharing. And so they can't worship God because they can't worship this sort of transcendent peaked point of power. In fact, he notes in the dialogue that modern people, modern democracies and their citizens are so confused that they've come to the conviction that power itself is bad, which for Schmitt is like saying God is bad, because power is beyond good and evil, and power is the only divine attribute. So Schmitt suggests at the end of the dialogue, or CS suggests, that secular democracies will generate the very conditions that might yet lift up a properly theologized divine power. The dictatorship, in other words, fascist dictatorship, might come out of a crisis of liberal, technological, secular democracies. Let me say that again. The dictatorship, Schmitt thinks that an emergency will happen within liberal, technological, democratic, secular societies that will allow dictators to step back on the stage. He speculates that the atom bomb has that potential. Quote, the atom bomb has escalated power boundlessly, page 44. And he thinks that although technology is initially invested in the modern delusion that power is merely intrahuman and natural, the atomic age might literally explode this assumption and suddenly, quote, power has slipped out of human hands such that it arrives again as, quote, an objective autonomous eminence which infinitely exceeds the narrow physical capacities of its individual human inventors, 45 to 46. And so the atom bomb slips the false boundaries of secular instrumental illusion and unleashes a measure of power so disproportionately enormous that it literally unveils and restores power's divine hierarchical attributes. What's CS going on about here? I think what he's trying to say is that secular liberal democracies, and this is very big on the right again, by the way, with the ascendance of various forms of Christian fascism in Europe and North America, that liberal secular democracies are going to basically self-destruct due to their godlessness. And this emergency, I think Schmitt is open to the fact that it doesn't have to be the atom bomb. He just places the atom bomb in there, but maybe it's something else. Maybe something else happens that creates a crisis or emergency that puts all the sort of godless, egalitarian individuals of democracy in awe of the need for a dictator to resolve the emergency. And so Schmitt sees the reestablishment of dictatorship in the polity as making possible the reestablishment of dictatorship in the cosmos. For him, in other words, secularism has to do with democracy's egalitarianism. Democracy's very notion that you can share power, for him, is inherently sort of atheistic because it levels things down. Whereas the cosmos, on Schmitt's view, is a dictatorship with God at its head. And so the crisis of liberal democracy will make possible a situation, maybe with the atom bomb, maybe something else, where a dictator will step on the stage and save the nation from godless secularism, liberalism, etc., and people will worship power again. So I hope this is clear how this ties into fascism. We can continue talking about it on Friday.